Okay, get ready for an absolutely wild story. We're talking about a tiny island nation that went through one of the most extreme economic booms and busts ever. It's a classic cautionary tale, rags to riches, and then back to something, well, something much, much worse.
So, how does that even happen? Seriously, how does a country become the richest on the entire planet per person only to lose, well, pretty much everything? That's the huge question, the central mystery we're going to unpack right now.
The country we're talking about is the Republic of Nauru. It's tiny, the world's third smallest nation, in fact. But its story, it's a huge, powerful, real-world lesson in something economists call the natural resource curse. It's this bizarre paradox where having immense natural wealth, the very thing that should make you rich, can actually lead to total ruin. All right, so where did this all start? Let's rewind the clock. We've got to go back to a time before all of the money, before the giant mines, back when Nauru was known by a completely different name. A name that, you'll see, was a lot more fitting. So picture this. It's 1789. British explorers land on this island, and they are just blown away by how beautiful it is. We're talking a lush green plateau, swaying palm trees, the whole deal. They were so impressed they literally named it Pleasant Island. But of course, hidden just beneath that perfect surface was a secret, a resource that was about to change its destiny forever. Now, this incredible wealth, it wasn't gold, it wasn't oil, it wasn't diamonds, it was phosphate. And what is phosphate? Well, it's basically millions of years of fossilized bird droppings. Yeah, you heard me right. It sounds kind of gross, I know, but this stuff was like gold dust because it's a key ingredient in fertilizer. And with the world's population booming, fertilizer was absolutely essential. That made this stuff incredibly valuable. So once this was discovered, it kicked off a total colonial free-for-all. First, Germany came in and started digging. Then after World War I, Australia took over and kept the mining going. For decades, the island's treasure was just stripped away and shipped off. And the people of Nauru, they saw almost none of the money. But everything changed in 1968, when Nauru finally won its independence. And the change to the island itself, it was just shocking. What was once called Pleasant Island was now being described by National Geographic as a ghastly tract of land. I mean, by the time Nauru actually got control of its own country, a staggering 80% of its land had been completely stripped bare. It left behind this barren, empty landscape that looked more like the surface of the moon. But hey, with independence, they finally got control of what was left of the phosphate. And for a brief, absolutely shining moment, Nauru became this totally unlikely paradise, swimming in just an insane amount of wealth. So let's put a number on this just so you can grasp the scale. At its peak back in 1981, the GDP per person in Nauru, when you adjust it for today's money, was a jaw-dropping $88,000. That made it, for a little while, the single richest country on the entire planet per capita. And just to put that into perspective for you, the average person in Nauru was literally twice as rich as the average American at the time. I mean, the scale of this sudden wealth is just, it's almost impossible to wrap your head around. So what does life even look like when you're that rich? Well, for starters, a lot of people just chose not to work. Why would you? They lived off government handouts and phosphate money. The country, with just 11,000 people, had its own national airline. And my favorite part, on an island you can literally drive around in less than an hour, sports cars became the must-have accessory. And there's this one story that just perfectly sums up how wild things got. The chief of police, right, he imports a brand new Lamborghini. The only problem? He discovered he was now too large to actually fit behind the wheel. And yeah, it's a funny image, but it was also a huge red flag for a much darker problem that was just around the corner. A massive health crisis. And here's the turn. This is where the paradise starts to crumble. Because that immense wealth, it brought a whole chain of unintended and ultimately devastating consequences that would lead to the country's total collapse. The first thing to go was people's health. Think about it. The mining had destroyed almost all the land you could farm on, so the traditional diet of fresh fish, coconuts, stuff like that, it was pretty much completely replaced by cheap, imported, processed food. Canned goods, instant noodles, soda. The result was a total health catastrophe. Nauru ended up with some of the highest rates of obesity and type 2 diabetes in the entire world. So you might be wondering, why didn't they develop other industries?
This is a textbook example of something called Dutch disease. Basically, when one resource, like phosphate, brings in so much easy money, it becomes nearly impossible for any other part of the economy to compete. You can't start a farm or a factory that can make that kind of profit. For Nauru, there was just zero economic reason to do anything other than mine. And this is so important to understand. Without really careful planning, a country's single biggest strength can actually choke out and kill the rest of its economy. Now, the government wasn't totally blind. They knew the phosphate was going to run out eventually, so they tried to invest for the future. The problem was, the execution was an absolute disaster. First, they poured billions into a national trust fund, only to lose most of it to sketchy investments and straight-up fraud. Then they tried to turn Nauru into an offshore banking haven, which just ended up attracting money launderers and getting them hit with international sanctions. And then there's the most infamous one. They decided to fund a musical in London about Leonardo da Vinci. That was one of the biggest flops in theater history. You add all of that up, and the result was complete financial ruin. I mean, the country went so broke that its own central bank went bankrupt. Creditors started repossessing everything, their overseas properties, even the planes from their national airline. Just like that, the money was all gone. So, what do you do? What happens when you're the richest country in the world, and then you run out of money, and you run out of the one thing that made you rich? The nation had to find a new way to survive, and it turned out to be a deeply, deeply controversial one. By the early 2000s, the situation was just grim. The phosphate was gone. Unemployment shot up to 90%. 90! The school system had basically collapsed. For all intents and purposes, Nauru had become a failed state. A lifeline eventually came from its huge neighbor, Australia. It was a policy called the Pacific Solution. And what it meant was that Australia started paying Nauru to host offshore detention centers for asylum seekers trying to reach Australia by boat. Now, this policy is and remains incredibly controversial, but those payments became the main source of income, keeping Nauru's entire economy from completely disappearing.
And this one quote from a Nauruan church minister who saw the whole thing happen, it just captures the heartbreak of it all. This is a man who remembered what the island was like when it was still Pleasant Island. He watched it get turned into a wasteland, and he said he wished they had never, ever discovered that phosphate in the first place. So the story of Nauru really leaves us with this one big question, and it's a question for any nation that's been blessed, or maybe cursed, with a ton of natural resources. Is finding that kind of wealth a ticket to a prosperous future, or is it just planting the seeds of your own destruction?